Hello, folks. Welcome. My name is Dan Kovatz. I'm with the Illinois Democratic County Chairs Association. Thank you for being here today. Before we get started, just a couple of ground rules that we do have. We have a lot of people here, and a lot of people will have some questions. For today, we just ask everyone, please be respectful of each other. Please be respectful with your questions. We ask that we have no outbursts for today. For questions, we have a row of chairs set up here, and we have an individual who will be holding the microphone throughout the session here. If you have a question, please step over, take a seat, and we'll go one at a time through the questions. We do ask that you not videotape today. We have a streaming service that is streaming this live if you care to look at that later. And just make sure that, again, we're just respectful and civil and have a good discussion today. So with that, I'd like to ask former Congressman Glenn Pichard to come up and say a few words.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Thanks, Dan, for the tremendous job you do as our executive director for our County Chairman's Association. We really appreciate it. We have a lady here today that just does yeoman effort for the party and has for many, many years. She's everywhere. She's my counterpart, our Democrat chair lady for this congressional district, Vivian Robinson. She does it. She's great. Appreciate her. I'll be brief here, but I'll just take a minute. There are a couple founding principles upon which our founding fathers held to be true with respect to the republic and a democracy. One was that if you can envision a ship of state out on the ocean, and we need to get into a safe harbor. And so a basic principle of our process as a democracy is that we call on our leaders to send them up to the crow's nest to look at the broader vision for us out on the horizon, something we can't see from the deck of the ship as we the people. So we send them up there. And they have all kinds of information available to them in Washington, D.C., in the way of investigative reports, policy manuals, everything that they can look at that the public doesn't get to see. And we depend upon their judgment to make a decision that keeps the democracy safe and the ship of state safe going into the harbor. And the people then, when those people come down from the crow's nest to the deck of the ship where we the people are, they have a solemn obligation to explain to us why they voted the way they voted, what policy they read, what they saw on the horizon that we can't see. And then we the people, have a solemn obligation to pass judgment on their decisions. Okay? That's what the process is all about. The power rests with we the people, not the folks in the crow's nest. They're servants of the people. The people send them there. All right? That's right. So, that's the first principle. The second principle is, after that exchange has taken place between the servant and the people, all right, then we have to exercise our solemn obligation to go to the polls and vote. If we agree with their judgment, we can vote to send them back to the crow's nest. If we disagree with it, we can vote to call them down. But it is their solemn obligation to have those open, free, and transparent discussions with us so that we can judge whether they made the right decision or not. But their second obligation is, if in the will of the people's judgment, we judge to call them down from the crow's nest, okay, they must come willingly. Willingly. That's the personal switch of power that we have enjoyed from the time this democracy was formed by our Declaration and our Constitution. They have to come willingly. And if they object to that, then they're putting in dire straits the democracy itself. And there's a lot of folks in this country think what happened in 2020 when the president didn't come down willingly, all right, after the call of the judgment of the people, that it took away from the substance of our democracy. So it is my duty and my honor here today to introduce you to a young man who's been a great U.S. congressman, who has come here to help us understand better the issues that are faced by our representatives in Congress, and to explain to you respectfully, after you have respectfully asked him questions, about what those issues are and why we vote the way we vote or the way he understands them. And that's what this meeting is all about. It's not an anti-boss meeting. It's not an anti-Republican meeting. It is about the democracy and the free exchange of discussions between the representatives we send to the crow's nest and the people on the deck of the ship who have the power in our government. Sean, where are you, buddy? Where'd you go? Here he is. Sean, come here. Sean, we are so thankful you've come here to have this discussion with our people. Thank you for, listen, the Masters tournament's going on a Sunday afternoon, and he drove all the way down here. I'm thankful for it. We all are.
Thank
all right, buddy.
Thank you so
Take
much,
care.
Glenn.
You bet.
I love listening to your remarks. I was saying outside the door, you can tell in this line of work when you stumble into someone who's in this job for the right reasons, and I appreciate your kind words, Glenn. My only thing I did take issue with you, as I mentioned outside, I'm in the only line of work where a 53-year-old man is referred to as a young person. But whatever, it is what it is. There's a running joke that the secret Senate handshake is like this. It's a bad joke. Anyway, let me. I'm here to answer your questions, but none of you can vote for me. Most of you, I'm sure, don't really know who I am. So I'll just give you a little bit of background to understand why I'm here. I am more surprised than any of you that I'm here right now. I took the standard way into Congress. I got an undergraduate degree in biochemistry, went back to grad school and got a degree in chemical engineering, worked as an engineer for a while, and got into manufacturing and spent 20 years in the energy industry, building energy plants inside industrials. Any really energy-intensive industrial, we were building stuff to help them save money by making their plants run a little better. So we built stuff, you name the energy-intensive sector, I've built a power plant in it, ethanol plants, steel mills, chemical plants, hospitals and universities. Was running a company in western Massachusetts where we did our manufacturing, and quite candidly, I realized at one point that that these plants tend not to be built near major airports. And if you're flying all over the country to build these plants, you get stuck in O'Hare a lot. And I sort of joked with my wife that, like, whenever we get a chance to relocate, I think I should live somewhere closer to O'Hare. And that was literally the conversation. So we moved out and live out in the Chicago suburbs in 2007 to continue to do that. And that was my political preparation. We sold our company in 2016, and I had been asked to go in by the people we sold the company to. They said, can you go meet with your local representative? Because there's just a whole bunch of rules that are making it harder for people like us who are trying to start small businesses, get them off the ground, get them running, get some of the rules cleaned up. So I let a group in. I had not really done that before. I sat down, I started making the case, and at some point my representative at the time stood up, looked at his watch, and he said, yeah, this meeting's over, and he walked out. And I went home and I said to my wife, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but he's going to be unemployed by the time it's over. And that was like the entirety of the thought, right? And what I sort of sat there, if that was sort of my political awakening, was sitting there and saying, like, I was born in 71, so the first president I really remember was Ronald Reagan. And our business wouldn't have existed but for Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan had led charges to deregulate a lot of previously regulated sectors. I always liked Fred Kahn, who oversaw the deregulation of the Aviation Administration, said the process of deregulation shifts the burden of consumer protection from price setting to antitrust enforcement. And so remember, we had the breakup of the big bells, I'm going to forget about all that deregulation happened under Reagan. That was a very pro-market idea. The EPA was created by Richard Nixon, right? And then of course, we had George H.W. Bush, who made it very clear that the United States is the defender of the post-World War II order. We are the beneficiary of the post-World War II order. And if another country like Iraq wants to come in and just take land from another country because they're stronger, we are not going to allow that, because that's not how the United States rolls. And that was sort of my understanding of how this was. And I couldn't believe that this guy was sort of walking out of the room on me. So I ran, and I won, which is crazy. And in the 6 years I've been in Congress, I've served on the Climate Committee, where we wrote substantially what became the Inflation Reduction Act. Because I spent a lot of time raising money from people with a lot more money than me on Wall Street. I've served in the Financial Services Committee, where we've overseen our financial markets, and I can get into plenty of detail with you on all of that. But the thing that really struck me, and it's what Glenn was saying, that our founders had this crazy and naive idea that we would agree to be governed by a rule of law, and rule of law would survive because we would always fundamentally trust the virtue of the people in the country to put themselves first. Whether that's in the ballot box or whether that's the people that they elect to go do that service, rule of law doesn't actually work if you don't have virtuous people in those jobs, right? Because the person who's enforcing the law, if they decide not to enforce it, there is no check that exists in that system outside of the checks of other people who we also expect to be virtuous. And I didn't pick the time that I came into Congress, but I'm now starting my 4th term. I'm in a very purple district. I've never won more than 54% of the vote. So if you throw a dart in my district, you're probably going to hit someone who didn't vote for me. Please don't. But but what really struck me early on is that if we don't, as members of Congress, go out and be present, especially on the hardest issues of the day, then we don't believe in democracy. And so, my opponent had not done a town hall in 10 years, and I said, that's just not how we're going to roll. So we've done one a month in the last 6 years. I think we've done like 87 or so now. This one and the one in Dixon yesterday, the first one's not in the district, but whatever. And we've always done them especially on the hardest issues. So in the first Trump impeachment, we did a town hall on impeachment. There were a lot of people there who did not agree that we should impeach the president. But one of my proudest moments was at the end. A guy came up with a MAGA hat on, and he said, I don't agree with you, but I want to thank you for giving us a civics lesson. Because we all think we understand what the impeachment process is, but you need to understand how that works. The peak of inflation, we did a town hall on inflation. At the peak of all of the Chicago crime wave, we got the sheriff of Cook County to come and talk about what do we actually know from the crime statistics, what's being misrepresented. And you have to do that not because you're telling folks how to vote. You have to do that because you have to fundamentally trust at the end of the day that if everybody votes and if everybody understands the issues, we are going to collectively make the right decision as a country. And it's also not lost on me that in those 6 years I've been in Congress, we're in the 119th session now. So I have served in Congress for 3 118ths of our nation's history. In those 3 118ths of our nation's history, I've participated in half the impeachments that have ever happened in our country, half the attacks on the U.S. Capitol that have ever happened in our country, 100% of the evicted speakers of the House that have ever happened in our country, and thank you, George Santos, 20% of the evicted members of Congress. This has been an extremely historic time where I think folks are questioning, is this thing going to hold, right? And, I can't give you anything more than Winston Churchill gave the Brits back in 1940, which is to say, I don't know. I know what the stakes are. I know what it costs us all if we lose it. I know that there is no guarantee that if we fight to preserve it, we'll win. But I know that if we give up, the game's up. And so what we just have to do right now is understand what's going on and be out there and asking the hard questions. And when I was asked to come down here and address some folks downstate, I said I'm happy to do that because this is, like I said, I'm not asking for your vote because you can't give me your vote. I just want everybody to have access to the opinions, not the opinions, to the facts as best as I can articulate them. So that's why I'm here. Look forward to taking your questions until somebody says it's the last question that we have, and I'll do my best to answer. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know the answer. But want to be here because I got great faith in our democracy and I got great faith in Americans to preserve it. So thank you for having me.
Okay, folks. We're going to have folks sit over here and ask a question one at a time. And we ask that you limit yourself to one question so we have a lot of people here. We want to get through as many of the questions as possible. So make your way over here when there's an open seat, and we'll get you called on one at a time.
I'm going to take the liberty, since I'm the one that's holding the microphone, to ask the first question. But, Carterville, where you're at right now, is my hometown. I know you're from the western suburbs of Chicago, from the 6th District, and you've driven about 15 minutes in your district to get to the first 2 hours out of your district, and then the last 3 hours was in this district. Yeah. So you're a long way from home. And when you're talking to constituents in your area, I'm sure that you can find a lot of people that have similar viewpoints and a mindset that maybe you do. Not all. You come from a diverse district as well. But what should people from a congressman doing an out-of-district town hall, what should people from Southern Illinois expect to take from a meeting like this today?
So thanks for that. I think in some ways, there's a stereotype that, if you're from the Chicago area, it's probably all blue. I've never won an election by anything close to the margin that Mike Bost wins elections down here. It's a very purple district where I represent. I have parts of DuPage County that are pretty affluent, pretty highly educated. My district is also the highest percentage of union households of any district in the state. A lot of carpenters, a lot of electricians, a lot of building trades. I represent the only neighborhoods in Chicago that voted for Trump twice, and so it's a diverse group of people. I think what I tell young people who are thinking about running for Congress and they say, no, I really care about my local community and I want to represent them. And I tell them, if that's really what drives you, that's noble, you should do that, but if that's what drives you, you should run for mayor. Because 99% of what we do in Congress affects every American. We are, our form of government, we are expected to represent our community. We get elected by 1/435th of the population. But we all vote on the Farm Bill. We all vote on the NDAA. We all vote on tax policy. And there's very few cases where we're able to go down and say, I want to fix the pothole on that road. I want to help this business that's struggling to get by. We can try, but our tools our fingers are fat for those sorts of things. So what I hope you take out of this is just a perspective of someone who is 1/435th of the Congress, right? That's all I am. But it's a perspective, and just try to answer your questions.
I got to hold it. They told me to hold it.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome you for coming down here and giving us this opportunity to ask some questions that we're normally not able to do to our local congressman. But the one I have as a Social Security recipient, I'm hearing that I need to go in and visit my office or my benefits will be cut and updated. I called the office the other day and was on hold for an hour and never did get anybody, so maybe you can answer that question for me.
So it is hugely concerning, and I can't sugarcoat this. We are deep in a constitutional crisis. And when I say we're in a constitutional crisis, the legislative branch legislates. We write the laws. The executive branch executes. They execute the laws that we pass. If they fail to execute the laws consistent with how we pass them, they need to either be held in account for breaking the law or through our oversight role of going through and saying, okay, why are you doing this? The funding for the Social Security Administration, like the funding for the Veterans Affairs Office, like the funding for the SEC or the IRS, those are all set by Congress. And you may like or not like the existing laws. And that's as true if you're an electrician as if you're a president of the United States, right? But you have to obey those laws. And so when you've got a White House that is saying Congress has approved certain amounts of resources at the Social Security Administration, certain amounts of bodies, certain expectations for what they do, and you now have the executive branch saying we're going to ask people to retire, we're going to tell them that you can't take phone calls anymore, you got to do meetings in person, that is a violation of what the law is. That's a violation of congressional intent. Now, if you want to change that, you could go to Congress and ask Congress to change the law, but until they do that, that's the law. I will give you a little bit of, there was enough pushback that I think the Trump administration got a little bit spooked, and so they did back step and say that they are now accepting phone calls. In our office and the constituent services, we have found that it is taking longer to get answers than it used to because of both, I think, of the cuts, and I think there's an intentional scrambling of the decks where you're putting people who don't know how to do this job in a job over that they don't know how to do, even though they have another job they know how to do, and swapping them around. I can't prove that, but I think some of that's what's happening. I would really encourage you, one of the most powerful tools you have is to call your congressman, because I say that very seriously, because when the Social Security Administration gets a call from a member of Congress, stipulate they don't get the resources to do their job as well as they want to, but your member of Congress can force them to take your piece of paper off the pile and put it on the top of the pile. And that matters, right? We shouldn't have to do it, but that stuff matters. But we shouldn't be playing with, we shouldn't be playing with folks' security.
Chip, you go.
Hi, Congressman. My name is Chip Markle, and I want to thank you for coming down here. Like Mike said, our congressman is absent without leave. We don't get to talk to him personally. My question is, my mom is 90 years old. She survives on Social Security. She survives on Medicare. What are the effects that these cuts are going to have to those programs? I mean, are they going to be large enough to where our rural hospitals are going to be forced to close? Or, can you kind of let us know what those cuts are how they're going to affect us? So
let me talk about what is right now, and I'm going to try not to do this on every question, but there's what the laws are that Congress has passed, and then separately what can be done if you break those laws. If you assume the laws don't constrain, we can imagine it, the worst case scenario you can imagine is not as bad as it could be, because if the laws don't constrain, and I'm not trivializing that, I'm just saying there aren't enough hours in the day to talk through all that. The laws that we have passed and the budget that it was a very partisan budget, but it was a House and Senate budget that passed last week, do not, to the best of my knowledge, contemplate specific cuts in Social Security and Medicare. So at least legally, that's okay. Now, practically, they have within they're directing the Energy and Commerce Committee to cut their spending by $180 billion with a B. There is nothing in the Energy and Commerce Committee's jurisdiction that gets anywhere close to that size other than Medicaid. I think there's something like 200,000 people just in this congressional district who depend on Medicaid, but I would submit to you that all of us depend on Medicaid, because if someone who depends on Medicaid now doesn't have a community health center to give them their primary care, then they end up going to the emergency room, and now when you need the emergency room, that emergency room isn't open. There are a ton of hospitals. I would, if anybody here works in a hospital, you'll know this already. If you don't, ask people who run hospitals. Most hospitals are barely hanging on financially and depend substantially on that chunk of the population that is Medicaid eligible to provide them with enough money to come through. So if you cut the Medicaid program, you're all of a sudden got a ton of hospitals, especially in rural America, that are going to shut down because they just don't have enough cash coming through to keep the doors open. Shamari Figures, who represents a district in southern Alabama, he has 13 counties. He said 11 of them have one hospital, and all 11 of those are going to shut down. And he was saying, he's like, I don't know, this is a very rural district. He said, I don't know how to legitimately tell people that they should move here to start a business. If they say, well, if I start a business here, I'd also like to start a family, and say, well, too bad, because there's no place to have a baby, right? And so I think we're all exposed on that. There's also the question of, we know, you've heard this said 1,000 times, the Social Security program We all pay into it while we work. We take it out as we retire. As the demographics of the United States have gotten older, we've got about 10 years to make sure that folks who are 10 years or more from retirement have something there when they get through. It's a fixable problem, and there's legislation that we have been pushing for a while. John Larson from Connecticut is pushing it, that would basically fix the way that we tax to pay for Social Security, because right now the rule says you only pay on your first, it goes with inflation, I never remember the exact number, it's somewhere between $170,000 and $190,000. You pay your FICA tax on that number, and that's all you pay. So if anybody in this room is making $178,000, whatever the magic number is, you pay the exact same amount to Social Security every year that Elon Musk does, because it's capped. And so the fix that on Social Security would fix this is say, let's make sure that as you make more money, you also contribute more to it. And there's some patches and there's some complications on that. We got a lot of sponsors on that. We've not been able to find any Republican sponsors on that bill. And I don't mean to make it partisan, but it's hard because we're left saying, okay, if we care about this, we know the 10 years is coming. And if we are going to continually do things that increase the structural deficits of the United States, we're giving ourselves fewer degrees of freedom to solve that when it comes. As one of my board members used to say, and he was saying this about something else, but he said, sometimes I look at politics and I think it's like a car that is driving down the wrong lane of the road in planes, trains, and automobiles, and you can see the truck coming, and everyone in the car is sitting there saying, should we swerve? Like, let's give it another exit, see what happens, right? And we know what the right lane is, but we got to get over there.
The budget maybe doesn't specify, cut from Medicare, cut from Social Security, but we watch the news and they're saying that every expert says they can't reach these cuts without cutting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Is that your take on it?
Yeah, it's really Medicaid. So what they're doing, and there's a I'm going to put you all to sleep here if you're not careful on Senate procedure. The Senate has a rule that says that if you want to pass a policy change that will not cost the taxpayer anything, it needs 60 votes to break a filibuster. If you want to pass a rule that's paid for by the taxpayers through the budget, it only takes 50 votes to pass that. And so it is much easier to spend taxpayer money than to change rules to make businesses more efficient. It's goofy. Don't get me started on the structure of the Senate. But the result of that is what they're trying to do in this budget is saying, let's give instructions that can clear the Senate with a 50-seat majority, because they don't believe that what they're going to do is going to get any Democratic support. And so those instructions don't say cut this program, cut this program. What the instructions say is these committees need to reduce this much money. And structurally, to understand what they're doing, what their math says, we want to cut taxes for the richest people by $4.5 trillion. So that's the starting assumption. And then in order to pay for that, they make two assumptions. The first assumption is we're going to cut a whole bunch of services, but we're not going to touch Social Security or defense. If you don't touch Social Security and defense, that means you have to cut everything else by 60, 70%, because there isn't enough other money in the budget to get to those kind of cuts. The second thing that they're doing is saying we are going to assume for purposes of accounting that any tax cut which was made less than 10 years ago and is going to expire in the next year or two, namely the last round of Trump tax cuts, we're going to assume that's a baseline going forward. And so we don't have to assume that those taxes will go up and generate more revenue to offset. We're just going to assume that those tax cuts are always there, and therefore extending those tax cuts doesn't cost anything. I sort of say this is sort of like if you lost your job and you said, remember that vacation we took last year? We can do that again because that's in the baseline. Like it doesn't, you'd get kicked out of a freshman accounting class for that. But that's what they're doing to get it done. So because of those two pieces, they're left where you are going to be forced to make huge cuts to everything. Like Medicaid is the big one, but the Veterans Affairs Program, tons of aids. The Farm Bill is going to be atrocious this year because of those cuts, and it's just like you're really cutting down to the bone. I'll shut up in a second, but I've described this to people as saying that, like, if someone said to you, I'm spending too much on shoes, and so I've decided to cut off one of my legs, you'd say that's insane, right? And yet that's sort of the logic that, like, I've decided I have to do $4.5 trillion of tax cuts, so let's go shoe shopping.
So if they're not going to cut Social Security and they're not going to cut defense, everybody in this room needs to understand that all of these other programs are going to be decimated by those cuts.
Yeah.
Which is Medicare, Medicaid, the Veterans Affairs.
Department of Education. We're going to defund the police across the board. The police at the IRS who make sure you pay your taxes. The police at the SEC who make sure that corporations play fair. There's cuts all across the board. Yes. Yeah.
So
why don't we make sure that everybody gets a chance to? Right. I don't want to just talk about it. Appreciate.
So that's what we need to understand. That's going to happen.
Yes, my question is, if I were to lie to the Senate and say that I'm going to not make any move against Roe v. Wade, if I said that and lied like the 3 justices that are sitting on the Supreme Court now, who lied to the Senate, wouldn't I go to jail? And if I can go to jail because I lied to the Senate, why aren't they in jail?
So I'd bring this back a little bit to what I was saying about how rule of law depends on people of virtue. We take
officers. Why aren't they?
Well, I mean, I just want to talk about the legal angle here. When you go and testify before the Senate, before the House, you hold your hand up and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. To come back several years later and say, and we could all imagine ourselves in a situation where, you're in a court of law, you hold up your hand, and 2 years later somebody says, well, what you said there wasn't quite consistent. And you might reasonably say, well, circumstances change, the facts change, I answer to the best of my knowledge. That's not really a prosecutable offense. It's an indictment on their character, but it's not so much a prosecutable offense. And I think that the challenge that I find, and that what we've been trying to say is, there has always been a certain default presumption of good faith for folks who come before the Senate. And so when you've got people who come before the Senate for a confirmation and they say, let's come more recently. Pete Hegseth, when he went before the Senate, they said, you've got an alcohol problem. He said, yeah, but I promise not to drink again if I get this job. I mean, that was what he said, right? Now, if he drinks again, I'm not so much worried that he violated his oath. I'm violated that the Secretary of Defense might not be in a position to do the job as well as he should. And when we've now got these issues of, I'm not suggesting this was like substance abuse problem, but these issues with the signal chat is a huge problem, because you've got people in positions of great power who are communicating in ways that are compromising U.S. intelligence. Whether they did that because they were inebriated, whether they did that because they lacked good character, the cat's out of the bag at this point. And we've now got some of the conversations that that you get to have as a member of Congress with partners overseas. We're hearing from people saying, I don't know whether I should trust sharing intelligence with the United States in the way I used to, because the United States might be putting this on a chat thread where my enemies might get it. And it is insane that the United States of America can't be trusted by people who we have historically thought of as our allies to make sure that Americans stay safe, right? And that's a big deal. But again, it's not the sin is not that they lied under oath. The sin is that people of good character were not nominated to those positions, and the Senate then confirmed people without doing a closer inspection of their character.
Hi, thanks for coming, and I also want to thank John A. Logan for hosting this. And that's my education question. You mentioned education a few moments ago. I'm a product of public education, K through 12 and higher ed. And I saw under the Reagan administration, my tuition and fees double in the 80s. Now education is becoming too pricey for the normal household to send their kids to public higher education. Can you speak to this audience about the importance of public higher ed and education in general now that the DOE is threatened to exist? Thank you.
So thanks for the question, and thanks for teaching. I think one of the wisest things that's ever been said about public education was God, I'm having a brain fart. I'll give you the quote. Civil rights activist from the 50s, and he had this wonderful quote when he was talking to a bunch of teachers in Minnesota. And he said, "The purpose of education is to teach people how to ask questions of themselves. What is up? What is down? What is black? What is white? Is there a God in heaven or not? And society only succeeds to the extent that we are full of people who ask those questions. And no society really wants to have that type of person around." and his point was that, like, education has always been a political idea. The idea that we're going to give everybody equal access to knowledge, equal access to opportunity, has always been a threat from folks who benefited from a world where they were the controllers of information. We in the United States had a hugely successful 30, 40 years, in the post-war years, in no small part because we were the first country in the world that provided universal K through 12 education. And it wasn't as good in some parts of the country as others. It wasn't evenly spread. We certainly had our own racial challenges with making sure that there was equities there. But we were doing a better job than the rest of the world was for a long time at that. And so we had more skilled workers than the rest of the world did, more innovation and all that happened from there. And then the rest of the world did what the rest of the world does. They copied our good ideas. And so they went through and expanded it. And then you saw a number of European and Asian countries that said, this is such a good idea, we should go beyond. So let's also add pre-K so that often moms, but parents, don't have to make these trade-offs and can get their kids with some universal pre-K education, not just the people who can afford the fancy daycare. And then a lot of those countries also said, well, let's then also add some free college, or at least free is the wrong word. K through 12 is not free, but we've funded it in a way that everybody pays their fair share, right? So let's go and do that. And the result of them doing that was we started to see a lot of those countries, like Korea, like Japan, like the Scandinavian countries, start to move ahead of us on a lot of those tables of education levels. And so we should now do what they do. We should copy good examples, right? We got to figure out a way to pay for it, but we've also got to understand that a society where more people are educated, more people are able to fulfill all of their talents, is a society that's going to raise all of our boats. And that's what we should be doing. And having said that, we are seeing a backlash, right? But it's the same backlash, that society doesn't really want that type of person around, right? James Baldwin, that's the name I was brain farting on.
They told me
Oh, okay. Yes, hi. My question has to do with the international aspect of what's happening in the United States. The phenomenon, if I can call it that, Donald Trump, is not only happening in the United States. It's happening in Germany, France, Italy, Hungary, and who knows what the other countries are going to be. So my question is whether you personally or anyone in the Congress, such as people who are on the Foreign Relations Committee, I don't know whether you're on that committee or not, but if you have thought about this phenomenon, what is the commonality between these movements, for lack of a better word? And basically, that's my first question. The second question, if I may, is a short domestic question. Go ahead, please. You want me to ask the second question?
Yeah, why don't you do both?
Okay, sure. Well, Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has said a few times that he's going to defund the judges that are blocking Donald Trump's executive orders. So my question is how possible that is, how probable it is to happen. Do you think it will have a chance of passing the Congress?
So the Congress voted on that bill last week. It passed the House. We are counting on the Senate because that is a filibusterable bill, and so I expect the Senate will not bring it up. But it is really scary, right? If we're going to decide, as Speaker Johnson has decided, that we're not going to do oversight of the president from the legislative branch, then we've only got one branch left to act as a check and balance, right? And that, this shouldn't be partisan, right? I mean, And I will tell you that a lot of my Republican colleagues, or, many of whom are friends, privately are very proud to be the party of Abraham Lincoln, who passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to make sure that we have equal protection and that everybody who was born in this country is a citizen of this country. They're very proud to be the party of Ronald Reagan, who was not under any confusion as to whether the Russians were our allies or our enemies. They're very proud to be the party of George H.W. Bush and like an aggressive U.S. foreign policy as defender of the rule of law. But they are very nervous that if they stand up to Trump, who has opposed all of those things, that will cost them their job. And I'm hoping that the Senate protects against that. On the international side, I think broadly there's some data that's really troubling, but I think we have to grapple with it, that of all the countries that have sort of moved, where some of like the far right, and you mentioned Germany, like AfD in Germany is literally the descendant of the Nazi Party. Elon Musk endorsed them, but that's who they are. As we've seen the rise of the far right in Germany and France, certainly in this country, the one country that really hasn't gone that way is Japan. And the political theorists who look at this say the one thing that makes Japan really different is that Japan has been totally closed to immigration. And that a lot of the fuel that's firing up the far right is that if you feel left behind in society, whether that was by virtue of policy, maybe it was by virtue of something you did, but whatever is the thing that caused you to be left behind, there is always the opportunity for a demagogue in that moment to say your troubles are caused by someone who doesn't look like you. And so we've always seen these periods in our history, particularly periods we have right now. I mean, the Department of Defense was saying 20 years ago that climate change was the biggest threat to long-term global security because the desertification of northern Africa was going to cause crops to fail, that was going to lead hordes of migrants to move up into Europe and was going to destabilize Europe and was going to hurt those North African countries. It sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? We've got tons of people who are coming up to our southern border because hurricanes are hitting Haiti, hurricanes are hitting Honduras, hurricanes are hitting Guatemala, and they're doing what we do, like let me find a better place, but it's fuel for that far right. And what I think we have to keep reminding people of, let me just read you a quote here that I keep handy. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we are a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future. If we ever closed our door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost. That was Ronald Reagan. So there is a way to be a very respected, honored figure on the right and appeal to hope in the future and not demonization of people who don't look like us. But we need people in positions of power to use their voice to articulate that vision a little bit more loudly.
Okay. Now, this is going to be my last one. I'm sorry. I apologize for asking too many questions, but it's an important, obviously, meeting here. But there are trade. First of all, I do economics for a living, or at least I did. I'm retired now. But most economists and most economic literature speaks to the fact that free trade is good for growth. There's almost no doubt about that. But the question is it all positive and no negative? The answer is no, that's not the way it works. It does kill jobs. As we moved away from traditional sectors of the economy that was more labor intensive towards capital intensive sectors, and gave those labor-intensive sectors to foreign countries to take care of, to Mexico, to Vietnam, and so on. People who were in those labor-intensive industries lost their jobs, no doubt about it.
So I don't want to be rude, but can we just get to the question? Because we got a long line here, and I want to make sure we...
So my question is there anything that the Congress is thinking about? I know that there is a fund that's been around since early 1960s that helps people who lose their jobs due to trade. But that fund is very limited, and it's not working well. I was wondering whether there's any thought about upgrading that fund.
Yeah, so what we did a lot in the last administration, and I think there's I think there's sort of a healthy re-examination of the role of trade going on right now. We had under the NAFTA this idea that as long as consumer goods were cheap, that we were all profiting. And so if you had a factory in El Paso that was paying $8 an hour and a factory in Ciudad Juarez right across the border that was paying 80 cents an hour, move your factory there, pay less, and now all of a sudden your T-shirts will be cheaper. Well, that's net positive for consumers, but now you decimate all these communities that depended on that. And I think there's a certain sort of lazy academic economic theory. I'm not lumping you into this, but there's a certain lazy academic economic theory that says, well, every time there's been a technological advance, we've created more jobs than we've destroyed. And I think that is true, except that it never creates jobs for the people whose jobs get destroyed, right? And I think if we're not sort of intentional about welcoming the steam shovel and respecting John Henry, then we end up essentially radicalizing people who've lost faith in America. I used to do a fair amount of work in West Virginia, and we'd meet these people who just are completely convinced that doesn't matter whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, a Whig, a Federalist, you don't give a damn about me. And that risks the fabric of America if we don't go through and look at that. What we did in the Inflation Reduction Act was to say that we want to provide greater tax credits to communities that are transitioning away from older industries, so that we make sure that those specific, it may not be the same individual, but let's at least make sure that community sees this energy transition or whatever technological transition as something that helps for them. We also, through the Loan Program Office, that was a big part of that, we're trying to very intentionally provide loans to businesses that could not attract money from the private sector, but if they attracted money with the strings that you had to build your factory in America, that you would actually, you'd build and grow here. One of the early companies that took advantage of the Loan Program Office was Tesla, right? And that matters, right? Like, we think of that today as an American success story, as we should, but that was a very intentional part of our policy. I should mention the Loan Program Office has had almost all their staff laid off in the new administration. So there is a concern, but I think there is an intentionality and a thought process to go through now about trying to make sure that we still embrace technology, we still embrace free trade, but we also recognize that if you're just better at making widgets than I am, you should be able to sell your widgets. If the only reason you're better is because you don't have to comply with environmental standards and labor protections that we do in the U.S., that's now the appropriate time to use focused tariff policy to try to level the playing field for U.S. manufacturers, which is not what this tariff policy is, but there's a tool to use that in a more thoughtful way.
Hey, out of respect for everybody in the room, I want to make sure that you got your question narrowed down to one question. And I know you're the biggest guy in the room. Hang on a minute. You can't hold this microphone either. They told me not to let anybody have it.
Congressman, my name is John Sims. I'm an ordained minister, so be prepared. And a proud veteran. Aside from the ethics of what's going on in the federal budget cutting thing, what in the world's going on with the Veterans Administration, and what can we do about it? That's my one question.
So thank you. Thank you for your service, and because I'm not an ordained minister, I'm going to try not to express my opinions with salty language. At least not in your company. So part of this is the answer that I said before, that legally, Congress has funded the Veterans Affairs Administration, has funded these programs, and until there's an act of Congress, we cannot be cutting those benefits. Ethically, we ask people to risk their lives for our country. We ask them to be separated from their families, to go live for indeterminate periods of time in tough parts of the world. We don't pay them nearly as much as they might be able to make in other jobs, but we ask them to do it on account of their patriotism, and that when they get back, we will treat them with dignity. And when we cut the Veterans Affairs program, we are not holding up our end of that deal. what's happened, and to give you like a little bit of like this bizarro context that first came to us, our office does this thing every year, Valentines for Vets. We reach out to all the elementary schools and say, would you write some Valentines to veterans? And I think we got like 3,500 Valentines this year, and then we go deliver them to some of the veterans hospitals and clinics out in the district. I went to one of the big veterans hospitals in our district this year, and for the first time in my 6 years in Congress, we didn't know until that morning whether we were going to be allowed to come in. And the director there said, we have been told by the White House that we have to clear every visitor for some political reason that we haven't yet figured out. And I'm sitting there saying, we're trying to wish a happy Valentine's Day to a veteran. Like, why can't we do that, right? We passed last term on a very bipartisan basis, I would point out, the PACT Act. And the PACT Act was a bill that fixed a huge hole in our veterans' benefits, primarily for Vietnam veterans that were exposed to Agent Orange and Gulf War veterans who were exposed to toxic burn pits. The rule at the VA before had been that if you were going to get treatment for those conditions, you have to demonstrate that your condition was caused directly by those exposures. Well, if you're a Vietnam-era vet and all of a sudden you're getting a cancer and you've got to try to prove that this was because of Agent Orange exposure in 1968, that's an almost impossible task. And so a lot of folks were getting left behind. So what we did in the PACT Act was said, here's the whole set of medical conditions where if you show any of these symptoms, we're simply going to stipulate that that was because of your service and you get coverage. We passed that, again, very bipartisan. The administration is now not funding that program. And I cannot figure out when one of my colleagues across the aisle who proudly voted for that PACT Act is going to stand up to Donald Trump and say, this is unacceptable, right? If you want to ask us to change the law, you have a process, submit a budget request, and as someone who loves our veterans, I will tell you to pound sand. But that's how you change the law. You can't just choose not to fund these programs. And so now you have all these programs that are not being funded because we've got a handful of members of Congress who don't want to stand up. And the casualties are all the people who we made a promise to, right? I mean, and I think I did a pretty good job of not getting too salty here, but I find myself thinking of this advice. We had a former board member of mine who, when we were in a fairly testy board meeting one day, he got us all calmed down, and he said, the only thing that matters in this life is whether your grandchildren can say they were proud of you. And I do look around sometime and say, do you talk to your grandkids at night? Or your kids? Yeah.
Thank you for coming. My name is Les Lloyd, and I'd also like for Judy Ashby to come up with me. We do have one question, and it's a question that you actually posed earlier in one of your examples. And I'm going to give you a little background first. Myself, and I believe Judy, we have made multiple attempts to communicate with Mr. Bost. I've called so often that one time the phone was answered, hello, Miss Lloyd. They recognized my voice. I've sent letters. I received letters back. So Judy and I went to D.C. to meet with Mr. Bost this past week. We did not get to meet with him. We met with one of his aides. I'll let Judy summarize how it went with the aide, and then I'll follow up with the question.
She was rather frosty. She had the impression, because of who reserved the time for the meeting, that it was about education. Well, and of course we had other questions, other issues to look at, and she interrupted the conversation and said, I was under the impression this was about education, and she complained that there was a lack of transparency. So basically she was pointing her finger at us and saying, you guys were not adequate. Shortly thereafter, she stopped listening. She took her folder and went, boom, and she was out of there. And we found out later afterwards that Bost had come into the office, passed by the door where we're meeting, went out the other door.
He didn't bother to even stick his head in to the five of us that were sitting there and say, I acknowledge you're my constituents. Thank you for coming by. I have something going on. I don't have time. There was nothing. And when you go that far, and we had 40 Illinoisans there total, and people from other congressional districts were meeting with us, like Danny Davis. but we couldn't even get a toe in the door. So my question to you is, what's next? You said, I don't know what's next, but he's going to be unemployed. What's next for us as the constituents that have gone that far and put out so much effort, and we're still not getting to meet with him face to face?
Well, so let me first just, I wasn't there, and I'm not here to, I'm not here to praise Caesar nor to bury him. I will give a certain amount of sympathy to Mr. Bost, only from my perspective. We get, for every 1,000 requests we get for people who want to meet with me, there's enough time in my day to meet with maybe 10 of them a week, right? And so I wouldn't necessarily take offense at any member of Congress because you couldn't get a meeting with someone beyond the staff level, because otherwise Congress we'd never have time to do anything, right? So without getting into the why and everything else, I would also say that one of the easiest ways to make sure you get reelected is just to do good constituent services. I think all of us know people who say, I didn't vote for you before, but then you made sure that, my grandpa got his Purple Heart returned, and I'll never vote against you again, right? And so that stuff is kind of politics 101. Don't make your constituents leave unhappy. What happens with that? But that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point. I don't have any good advice to you other than to say that there have been plenty of periods in our history, plenty of members of Congress who were non-responsive to public will, and sometimes that lasted for long periods of time, right? I find myself, particularly in this moment, thinking a lot about the civil rights era, because in 1864, I think, we passed the 14th Amendment that said everybody's subject to equal protection and everybody's got the right to vote. And it took 100 years to 1964 before we passed the Civil Rights Act that said we're actually going to enforce those provisions. And I'm not asking you to wait 100 years, but I also think that, I think the lesson that I take from the Civil Rights era was that you had people who never gave up on America, who, and I served with John Lewis, and I often hear his voice in my head when we would have conversations like this, and he'd say, you have to dramatize the situation. And he said that because he's like, how do you find the way to create a public scene where, number one, you cannot be ignored, but number two, anybody watching the scene there is no ambiguity about who is right and who is wrong in this conversation. And that's not easy, right? Because there's certainly been plenty of eras where people were there with the right intention, but it was not understood in the way that they intended. But that's the only way we've moved forward from moments like this in the past.
I have one quick practical question. We can do rallies, we can make phone calls, we can send emails, we can make a noise, we can write letters to the editor. What concrete thing can all of us actually do to change this, other than, are we going to get to the point where we stand in front of a door with arms locked to stop it? Something practical.
All of that and more, and I'll maybe just share. I don't know if you all remember Fiona Hill, who was she was one of the impeachment witnesses and the first witness, and wonderful woman. And I was meeting with her several years after the first impeachment, unrelated to impeachment, talking about our U.S. foreign policy with Russia. And she said that the mistake that the United States has often made with Russia is to assume that Vladimir Putin has a strategy, and we need a counter strategy. And she said what Putin does is he does 1,000 tactics at once. He is completely shameless about the tactics. Most of them don't work, and then he doubles down on the ones that work. And he said, we look at that and we don't see all the stuff, if we're not paying close attention, we don't see all the stuff that didn't work. And we conclude he had a strategy. But she said, if we respond to that by sitting back and saying, I need to craft a careful counter strategy to this, then he's going to win every time. We have to counter that by doing 1,000 tactics in the other direction and doubling down that work. And if you see like someone's doing 1,000 tactics, lots of them don't work, and he keeps doubling down on them and seems to be completely shameless and are thinking of someone else, just saying. But I think going back to the civil rights era, that was essentially what they were doing, right? We hear the story about, the sit-in at the Woolworths and the bus rides, but like you read what they were actually doing. They were doing 15 things that didn't work, right? And the Woolworths worked, and they said, all right, well, let's do that in Memphis then, because it worked over here, right? And I think like my answer to you is I don't know what the answer is, but if you do something and it doesn't work, stop doing it. If you do something and it works, do it again louder. Hear, hear.
Hi there. So I have a long history in the motorcyclist rights movement, and that's pertinent to my question because back in the 80s it was determined that any state that didn't pass a helmet law was going to have 10% of their highway funds withheld. And it was determined, largely in part because of the motorcyclist rights movement, that that's illegal, that you cannot blackmail people to withhold their federal funds with blackmail. So talk to me about Columbia University and SIU and organizations that are now being blackmailed saying, if you don't comply with my will, I'm going to withhold your federal funds.
So I want to be a little bit nuanced because I think there's two separate pieces in there. I went to college in Vermont. This is relevant because when I got there as a freshman in the fall of 1989, the seniors had all been grandfathered and were able to buy alcohol for all 4 years of college, and I was not. Vermont was the last state that raised the drinking age to 21, and it was because we had passed a law in Congress that said that you will not get your federal highway funding unless you raise the drinking age to 21. And Vermont doesn't have a lot of federal highways, so they were the last one to go through. And I just missed it, so I had to go to Montreal. And I say that because I think there's a robust history in this country of saying when the federal government wants states, wants municipalities to do things that where we don't have direct authority, we will use the power of the purse to try to effectuate that. And I don't think that's necessarily bribery, right? Like, it's how we raise the drinking age. It's also, remember, like George Bush II, W. Bush, his No Child Left Behind Act said that schools if you want to get access to certain federal funds, you're going to have to meet these testing standards. And we can question whether that was good or bad, but nobody questioned whether it was illegal, right? We might question whether the law was good, but not whether it was illegal. What Trump is doing with the universities is different because there is no enabling law behind that, right? That's a very different question to say, I, as a 34-time convicted felon, would like you to break the law on my behalf, and if you don't, I am going to use the power of my job to take money away from you. If Congress passed a law that said he could do that, that's a different conversation. But but Congress clearly has the power of the purse under the Constitution. We have the Impoundment Control Act that says that the executive branch cannot impound funds that were approved by Congress. So if we approved money to fund a research grant at Columbia, you can't take that away without Congress giving you the okay on that, right? And so what's there, like, yes, it's a bribe, but it's also grossly illegal. And I think a lot of the challenge, we're in the process of preparing some letters to a lot of the law firms that I think there's a very strong case to be made that some of these law firms that are folding are actually violating anti-bribery statutes. Because if you're saying our law firm will provide you with legal services in exchange for you doing a political favor, that's clearly illegal. And I think we all need to make it clear to folks that that's, we are a country of laws. I mean, and like, look, I tell people all the time, like, I represent Henry Hyde's district. Henry Hyde was a Republican for years, known mostly today for having passed the Hyde Amendment that says that no federal money can ever be used to pay for an abortion. Wherever you stand on that issue, it is not my view. It is not my choice to not follow that law simply because I disagree, as long as that law is on the books, right? And so if we defend the rule of law, you have to insist that the law applies to everybody, regardless of whether or not they agree with it, because otherwise it's Mad Max.
Well, thank you for putting out the invitation, and I'm glad that clearly we're not on the right side of laws. Okay, but speaking of laws, are we not a country based on laws, like sovereignties and everything, based on laws? And I am a result of a immigrant who arrived here legally, and thankfully he wasn't accepted on the Titanic, for which he had a ticket for, but that's another story. But he ended up here and came to this country legally. And I'm thankful for all the people that do come here legally. So here's my question, okay? You're talking about funding of things. And last week I became 65, and I'm waiting to collect my Social Security. So mine's about Social Security, okay? Why has there been so many discoveries of hundreds of billions of our tax money wasted in the past administration through ideological giveaways to other countries, and why were Social Security cards and Medicaid issued to the millions of illegal migrants who came into the country?
So let me first let me unpack, because there's a great article in the New York Times today that I'd encourage you to read that says that Elon Musk is saying that Doge is not going to be able to deliver the size of the cuts he has said he's going to, and they point out that the size of the cuts he's claiming he is going to deliver exceed the total budget of all the agencies he's digging into, which is to say that when you have somebody saying, I have identified all of these savings, and in this bag full of $100, I have $10 million, the fact that he said it doesn't mean he's got $10 million in the bag. What's happened, and there are ways that Congress and the government seek to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. The primary way we do that, which is the law, is we have whistleblowers and inspectors general who are independent, non-political actors whose job is to be resources so that if you, let's say you as a patriotic American are working inside the Social Security Administration and you notice that one of your colleagues, maybe a superior of yours, is doing illegal things, you would be in a politically difficult situation to raise that. Maybe it might cost you your job. And so we have inspectors general who are there that you can raise that through. One of the first actions that Trump did was fire the inspectors general. So those people are now not there. And now we have people who are making claims who are not even government employees. I mean, a lot of these people are special government employees, have never worked in the public sector before, are drawing conclusions based on incomplete information. I mean, I'll give you a crazy one. There's this comment going around that we're paying money to people who are 150 years old. The reason why the data says that, so if all you know is you took a computer science class and a math class and you subtract 2024 from a number and it says you're 150 years old, if that's all you know, that sounds like fraud. Well, what actually happens, and I think a lot of the people in this room probably know this, sometimes when you fill out your paperwork, you don't have your birth certificate. Sometimes maybe you were born in a situation where you don't actually even know your birthday. Maybe you never met your parents. But you've got evidence that you are a U.S. citizen. Well, when the Social Security Administration sees that, they just enter a default number. And so this is a process question where these are real people who a quick phone call would identify, or talking to the people in the agency who've been there would identify that you, ma'am, are not actually 150 years old, as I can tell by looking at you, even though your paperwork says that you were born, somewhere at the end of the Civil War, right? That's not fraud. That is pure laziness and incompetence on the part of people who fired the talented people to answer the questions. And so then I just want to take the immigration piece separately. The population of people who are, broadly speaking, undocumented, and I prefer the word undocumented to illegal because you need to understand how people get into that bucket. The majority of those folks are visa overstays. Not people who came across the border, they're visa overstays. You came here for a student to study in college. Maybe you met someone, you fell in love, you're hoping to stick around here, you're trying to get a green card, you're bouncing back and forth, you don't have your visa. You are now undocumented. That's the majority of the undocumented folks in our country. The second biggest category is farm workers. About 1 million farm workers a year come back and forth across the border because they follow the harvest. If you travel from Texas to Wyoming following the cattle harvest, you are not a migrant. If you travel from Mexico to Texas, you are. But these farm workers move back and forth and are out there. You've then got dreamers, people who were not born in this country but came here when they were infants. Their parents brought them here. They didn't have paperwork, but they went to school here. Many times they've served in our military. They've gone on. They've served. And our government said to them, under the DREAM Act, said if you identify who you are and you don't break the law for a finite period of time, we will put you on a path to citizenship. The last category you've got are temporary protected status holders. These are people who come here because they're seeking asylum, they're in a horrible situation at home, maybe a gang has taken over their town, they come here, they're seeking freedom. They come and our government says to them, we're going to give you a court date. We're not going to send you back because it would be inhumane for us to send you back until your court date is adjudicated. And the court case may find that you are lying, in which case we'll send you back. But in the interim, as long as you don't do anything bad and get arrested, you can stay here. Now those people, those dreamers, those TPS workers, they are working, they're getting paid, and we say, okay, if you're going to sit here and work and get paid, we want you to be paying money into Social Security, right? So yes, of course they're in the Social Security system because they are trying to do the right thing and get here. And when we then go to those people and say, we made you a promise that if you do the right thing, we are going to look out for you. And now we say to those people, I'm going to put you on a plane to El Salvador. What does that do to us as a country? I gave you my Ronald Reagan quote again, right? The day we close our door to new Americans, our leadership in the world will soon be lost. That ain't fraud. That's how we actually made America great.
One more. Congressman, I'm sorry that I allowed somebody to ask 2 or 3 questions before. I'm going to hold them to one question only from here on out.
And I promise I have one question. I am a divorced mother of 2 adult women. One is married and one is not. I did the right thing. I've done the right thing all my life. I have my birth certificate. I have my divorce papers, my marriage certificate, my real ID that I just got this year, but the SAVE Act. Do I need to, which I was going to get a passport to go to Ireland, but am I, as a divorced woman who kept my ex-husband's name, do I need to get a passport so that I can vote the next time? Or is the real ID good enough, which is what they're forcing us to get?
So the SAVE Act, much like I think 2 questions ago, we are counting on the Senate not to sign that into law. So it has passed the House. It is not the law unless the Senate votes on it. We're hoping we can keep it that way. I can't answer your question because the SAVE Act is so poorly worded. 84% of married women in America change their name, which means that 84% of married women in America do not have a government identification or otherwise that matches the name on their birth certificate. And the SAVE Act says nothing about how to address that issue. The SAVE Act also says nothing about what happens if you are a person who doesn't know where your birth certificate is, if you're not a person who has a passport, maybe because you haven't traveled, maybe because you don't have the money to go get a passport. Like, it's insane. Like, we don't charge a poll tax to vote. But if we're going to say, well, now you have to have the money to go hire somebody to track down your birth certificate or to go get a passport, we're essentially creating a poll tax, right? And I laugh sometimes because you have to. Remember the scene in The Breakfast Club where they're all sitting around and Anthony Michael Hall, who plays the nerd, has a fake ID, and the Emilio Estevez, who's the jock, looks at his fake ID and he says, "It says you're 19." And he's like, "Yeah." He said, "Why did your fake ID only say you're 19? Why'd you get a fake ID?" And he goes, "To vote." We understand why that's funny, because that's not why people get fake IDs. And yet we have this whole, very high and mighty conversation of well, immigrants are coming here to vote. That's not why they're coming here. Come on, right? That's not the problem that's being protected against. What's being protected against is that if you identify the married women who have changed their name, people who are economically insecure, people who maybe have gone through some bout of homelessness in their life and can't track down their birth certificate. You are getting a population whose voting propensities skew in a certain direction. This is a tool for voter disenfranchisement. That's all it is.
Okay, you got it. You got it.
I wouldn't let the preacher hold it.
Yeah, exactly. Congressman. Congressman.
From Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
I know you only have a few minutes left here, but I have to ask you a very difficult question as one Democrat to another. Because as State Central Committeeman now, I represent 34 counties in this state, which is 1/3 of the entire state geographically. I tell you what I hear going around that district, which is predominantly rural, okay? They tell me, what are you guys talking about? All we're hearing is cultural issues coming out of the Democrat Party. Do you understand that we can't get child care here? That 2 people with 2 children are paying $1,200 a month for child care when you can find it? That we've got food deserts in towns as large as 1,000 people where people can't go to a grocery store? That we've got children who doctors won't see because they're on Medicaid and they got their teeth falling out and rotting out? Why isn't the Democrat Party talking about those issues again, which we used to address, but now we've become so urban-centric that the Democrat Party has forgotten rural America? Now, I'm just telling you what these folks are telling me. I know we haven't, but they know that Mike Boss is not going to speak to those issues. And if we don't speak to them, who's going to solve those problems? You know, I understand the cultural issues and how important they are to the party, but we got to get back to bread and butter table issues also, because I'll tell you what, in the last election, and I'm just going to say this because we need to understand it, all right? Donald Trump came to Evansville, Indiana. He came to Cape Girardeau, Missouri. He came to Southern Illinois Airport 3 miles from my home. We can't get a Democrat presidential candidate to come downstate for love nor money. They don't get out of Chicago or St. Louis. So I'm not being adversarial to my own party, but you understand that Democrats in rural America are feeling that the party is forgetting their basic issues. And that's why, you know, Donald Trump doesn't even worry about those rural states. He doesn't have to do anything because he's going to win them, because they think we're not speaking to their issues. I'm just trying to deal with the political reality here. The party gave up a seat on the Democrat National Committee that had a rural office attached to it. It doesn't even exist anymore for the person who's supposed to be focusing the party on rural issues. Why? Sean, I'm putting difficult questions to you.
No,
but you know, I have to face the political reality too, because we've got a lot of great Democrats in rural America, but they want the party to start speaking to them.
Yeah, no, so thank you for asking the question. And you know, quite candidly, that's a part of why I came down here, because I'm aware of that. This is, you know, and I'm not running for Senate, right? I'm here because it matters to have those voices, and I'd like to believe that part of the reason I was asked to come down is because, you know, I represent a community that is very purple, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I spent a lot of my life before this bouncing around to a lot of places that were a long way from major metro areas. I don't know that I have a good answer, and maybe this is a longer conversation for you and I to have over a drink or two at some point. There was a time not that long ago when you could be a senior Republican from an urban part of the country. You know, Henry Hyde had my seat, right? Or you could be a senior Democrat from a rural part of the country like Tom Daschle, right? And in both cases, you were deemed to be in a pretty safe seat. And there's whole conversations about like how, like, you know, Rural America has depopulated, I think in some cases because of some policies made in the 80s and 90s, some of the stuff we talked about earlier. And and in many cases economically has not kept up with the economic growth in those other parts of the country. And that divide between urban and rural didn't used to be a partisan divide, but has become one where you look at just where people are elected. And I'm not saying this makes it right or wrong, but if I was running for Senate, I could look at a map of Illinois and say, man, there's like 3 deep red districts downstate and 13 very blue districts in the northern part of the state. I could probably just stay in these 13 districts and get the votes I need to win statewide, right? And if you're sitting there as a politician thinking, I only got so many hours in the day, where do I focus? It's not mean, it's just rational, right? And I could look the same way at Trump of saying, like, is Trump going to go to Orange County or DuPage County? Like, that would not be a good use of his time, but he's going to take his jet and bounce to rural America because that's where his voters are that he needs it. Both of those are wrong, but I think it's certainly on us as politicians, but I think it's on all of us as Americans. I tell everybody, go read Thomas Paine. When he was writing before the Constitution was written, he said, our great title is as Americans, our lesser title is the state we come from. It's by our great title we're known abroad, and by our lesser title we're known at home. And he was making the point because if we are to be these United States of America, we have to be committed to the idea that we're all Americans, not that we're Virginians and South Carolinians, because that was the fight at the time, right? Why would all these states agree to come together who had such different ideas? And I just think all of us have to try to find a way to do that, especially in this Trump era where we're all tempted to say, I'm going to judge you based on the yard sign you had 2 months ago, right? Like, and how do we get back to saying, I'll bet you anything that every person in this room disagrees with me on something, and I'll bet you anything that every one of us, if we walked out, we could find 15 things we agree on, right? And how do we get back to that? And I think all of us have an obligation to elevate that. But that's a bit of a cop-out answer, because I think in the short term, it's a dumb idea for me to be here. Thank you.
All right. Well, let me tell you, first of all, those people who are trying to get a hold of Mike Boston can't. Tell me someone who has been able to get a hold of him. It just doesn't exist. But my question is, school choice. What's your views on school choice? I'm a school bus driver. I see how what kids are being taught, what they are not being taught. I see kids dropping out of the public schools to be homeschooled. I think school choice is an excellent idea. What's your view?
So I'm happy to share with you my view. I also want to be cognizant of the fact that since you can't vote for me, my view is a partial answer. So let me just try to sort of walk through at least how I think about it, and how the Congress thinks about it, because most of that conversation is at a state level. Like, the vast majority of school regulation, school funding is made at the state and municipal level by your property taxes and your school boards, less impact from the state. The challenge that I think we all have to grapple with is, to the earlier question about how we provided universal K through 12 education in our country where everybody has access, and the way that we structured that to try to ensure that no one is left behind is to say that we are going to collect local and state taxes. Those local and state taxes are going to pay for a public school system. And that public school system is going to be available to anybody who lives in that community to go get access to it. We have always had layered on top of that choices that you can opt out of that system. Maybe you want to go to the parochial school, or whatever religious tradition you find, you want that sort of education, you can opt out, you can do that. Maybe you want to go to some expensive college prep school and you've got the resources, you can go through and do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with providing those choices, and I think we've had lots of success in this country of providing those. Maybe you want to homeschool, right? Whatever. Where I think the challenge gets is there's a pushback from people to say, well, if I'm taking my kid out of the school, I also want to take my tax dollars out, because I want to make sure that now, since my kid isn't using the school, I want to have money to pay for the other piece. And that's breaking the bargain, right? Because what that ends up doing is leave us in a position where the poorest communities, who already, let's be honest, struggle the most to provide a good education. I live in DuPage County. My property taxes are probably a lot higher than yours are. I'm not happy about that, but it also means that a school teacher in my school district probably gets paid a lot more than a school teacher does down here. My kids are no more deserving of a good education than kids down here, but if we were to find ourselves in a position where you had a bunch of people saying, particularly in those struggling school districts, I want to choose something else and I want to take my tax dollars with me, the first places they're going to lose are going to be communities like this that are struggling to attract the teachers, struggling to make sure that you got a good HVAC system that keeps kids safe, that you got computers, that you got lunch, all the stuff that a school provides. And so choice is fine. How you pay for the choice, you have to think very carefully about that.
This will be our last question.
I want your personal opinion. I'm one of those people who were out in the streets on the hands-on demonstration, and I'm there because I want
hands off, I think, but whatever.
Hands off, yeah.
I don't want to speculate what kind of demonstration you were at.
I'm there because I want to give a backbone to all those virtuous people in Congress who are not voting the right way because they're afraid to be Liz Cheney'd. Will it work? Will seeing thousands of people marching in the street help those people who know what the right thing is to do the right thing?
So thank you for going out, and the more you do it, the more it will work. And maybe this is an ideal one to end on. The way that fascism succeeds is you tell people that all of your problems are caused by something that only I can solve. And for me to solve this, I'm going to have to take greater power for myself, but I'm doing it because I'm looking out for you, right? And if you oppose me in my efforts to do that, I will use my powers against you and make you regret your life choices. That doesn't make fascism work. What makes fascism work is if people respond to that with cowardice. And you have right now, well, don't clap yet, because I don't think we're at a proud moment yet in our country. I say that seriously, right? Look around at how many people in our society right now are saying, I would like to stand up, but I have too much to lose. Right? Maybe it's a university that's saying, I want to have a diverse student body, but if I push to have a diverse student body, I'm going to lose research funding, and therefore I'm not going to be able to provide my educational mission, so it's probably best for me to keep my head down right now. Maybe it's one of those law firms who is saying, I'll do pro bono work even though it breaks the law, but if I don't do this, the partners at my law firm are going to be picked off by another law firm who will do this, and it's going to fold. Maybe you are one of my colleagues. I'm not going to name names here, but I have a lot of colleagues who have told me that they would love to be standing up right now, but they see what happened to Adam Kinzinger. They see that his security detail got pulled. They see that Donald Trump released people from jail who had attacked cops on January 6th, and they are now standing back and standing by waiting for his signal, and they're wondering whether, if they were to stand up right now, are they going to put their family's security at risk because everybody knows where we live? I think we can sympathize with all the fear that all those people have in that moment. And we can sympathize with the fact that everybody who has something to lose is keenly aware that if they stand up individually, they might lose it. That gives you two choices. You can either sit down or you can stand up collectively. And what you do by going to those rallies is show that you can stand up collectively and show by your courage that courage is beautiful and infectious. So go out and go infect some people with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Caston, for coming out. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Appreciate it. Have a good day.